You should be back to normal in about 6 months. Never before have I kept tabs on a date provided to me by a medical professional as closely as I monitored that 6-month anniversary date. It was March 2015, and the day before I had undergone an 8.5-hour surgery to remove a benign tumor the size of a small grape from the top of my brain. The tumor had been identified the prior summer after several weeks of fatigue and headaches led me to a local emergency room, where an MRI identified the lesion, partially wrapped around the sagittal sinus, the structure that carries spent blood from the brain through the jugular to the heart. It was a complicated surgery. In the months between initial diagnosis and surgery, I continued to experience headaches and developed other symptoms such as facial tics and speech arrest. Once the surgery was complete and successful, I couldn't wait to be back to normal in 6 months' time. I watched my calendar. My recovery was slow and largely unremarkable, but it did not benchmark well to the 6-month time frame to normalcy provided by both my surgeon and neurologist. And although I was thankful that my tumor was not cancer, my self-esteem since the diagnosis and subsequent surgery had plummeted. I was asking myself questions, telling myself stories. You are damaged. You will always be unwell. You are no longer strong. You will never be the same. Life will never be the same. The dark tendrils of depression were tickling the bottoms of my feet to remind me of their presence. We will probably hit a few rough patches in the coming weeks and months. It was late December 2018. These were the words of Cindy Brown, then chair of our board of trustees. She included them in the church's announcement regarding Reverend Chris Holton Jablonski and Lauren Smith's departure as South Church's settled ministers. About 1 month later, our new, at the time, board chair, CJ Cogswell, then laid out the board's plan of hiring an interim minister while undertaking steps to move into search for our new settled minister. It was a complicated time for our church. Our board, staff, and lay leaders buoyed us. They stepped up, assuming many roles not in their job descriptions. They made hard decisions. Many of us looked forward to the placement of the interim minister as a milestone in this transition, this journey towards settlement, towards spiritual and congregational growth. We watched our calendars. We asked ourselves questions. What would our new minister be like? How long will this process take? What will our church look like? Will it be the same? Will it be different? Some time has passed, and I won't go into details, but suffice to say, our congregation has been challenged in the years since that announcement. An interim minister assignment was ended early. A global pandemic delayed the search process and interrupted the functioning of our church. And the search that did not result in a new match for our new minister occurred earlier this year. What are you going to think about and dream about? When she turned 3 years old, my niece Scarlett began a new ritual each evening as I was putting her to bed. After recounting our days, reading a few stories, and tucking her in, she, long the queen of the bedtime stall, aren't they all, would look into my eyes and ask, Uncle Man, what are you going to think about and dream about? It was not complicated. It was beautiful. I would reply to the dream part of her question by describing some far-flung story where she and I would be masters of our own destiny on some grand adventure. I am going to dream about you and I with the dogs in a spaceship flying high above the earth, spying on your little brother with the help of our giant telescope. I would then address the first half of her question. What was I going to think about? I responded with something we had shared that made me grateful. I am going to think about how loving you were to your little brother when he fell off the monkey bars and hurt his hands. I would then ask her the same questions, and her responses would often be so much better than my own, as most things are through the eyes and minds of children. In contemplating my experiences, my stories, and researching the concept of story, I came across the work of writer Emily Esfahani Smith, which introduced me to a very interesting topic in psychology known as narrative identity, the internalized story you create about yourself. Think of it as your own personal myth. You decide what experiences, memories, emotions, people, and events get the most weight in what and how you feel when thinking about yourself. In other words, what are you going to think about and dream about when you think and dream about yourself? Northwestern University psychologist Professor Dan McAdams is an expert on this topic, studying it for over 30 years. During this time, Dr. McAdams has uncovered interesting trends. People who are driven to contribute to society and to future generations, he found, are more likely to tell redemptive stories about their lives, or stories that transition from bad to good. The opposite of redemptive stories are contamination stories, stories that can be interpreted as going from good to bad. People who tell contamination stories, McAdams has found, are less generative or less driven to contribute to society or to younger generations. They also tend to be more anxious, more depressed, and to feel that their lives are less coherent compared to those who tell redemptive stories. People who tell redemptive stories rate their lives as more meaningful than those who tell stories that have either no or fewer redemptive sequences. Narrative identity is important. When we want people to understand us, we share our stories or parts of our stories with them. When we want to know who another person is, we ask them to share their parts of their stories. What do you think about and dream about? Partly to process my health challenges and partly as a natural course of growing older, I have been thinking a lot recently about my narrative identity and have concluded that many of my narrative identity stories have been contamination stories. Surely, I have been blessed with more than my share of redemption stories, but my overall narrative identity has, over recent years, shifted towards more good to bad than bad to good. I am not the same person I was before my surgery. I am no longer thriving. This is complicated, and I want it to change. In reflecting on these thoughts within the context of our shared faith, I am reminded we work to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all people. I am worthy of my own dignity. Therefore, I have embarked upon a journey to change my narrative identity by emphasizing my redemptive stories, which are plentiful. I am blessed with health. I have had several clean MRIs in a row over the last few years and have no reason to believe this will change moving forward. I feel as though my work makes a difference. I recently celebrated 15 years of employment at a local biotech company. We make high-quality reagents that scientists use to advance the understanding of complex diseases such as cancer and even COVID. I am close with my partner, her daughters, and our shared families. Our bonds only strengthened during this pandemic over the last year plus. I am in community with you all. In our South Church community, we've journeyed through shared ups and downs of our church's transition from settled ministry. There have been, and still remain, many questions about what we will be, about who we will be. Over the past years, I have often thought about our narrative identity, the collective story of South Church that we share with the world. Recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a dominating force, which can feel like a huge weight that acts to compound our other challenges. As both individuals and as a community, we have been experiencing new stresses, fearing what the future may bring, what the world may look like post-pandemic, constantly being concerned by the risk of illness, spending time in quarantine, isolated from our networks, our neighbors, coworkers, friends, family, one another. We are all experiencing a new normal, wrought with challenges, but our congregation has done so with exceptional grace. Throughout this pandemic, we have continued to stand up for and act in line with our Unitarian Universalist beliefs. We maintained community and continued spiritual growth, in part by the rapid transition from in-person to online services and programming. These include continued engagement with our beloved music program. We successfully fundraised to fund this year's operating budget and started the important work of restoring the slate roof. Our youth have had plentiful opportunities to remain meaningfully connected to our community and to one another through our religious education programming efforts. We have cultivated a deep and meaningful relationship with our interim minister, Reverend Susan Zahusky Brown. She might as well be a doctor, she's great. Our associate and shared ministry teams have continued to live out their missions. This includes the work that we continue to do for social justice, never more important than in our world today. We adopted the collaborative leadership model as a congregation. Buddhist teacher Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams writes, "Today's progressive leaders must systematically and lovingly prepare us to tolerate the inherent discomfort of change now in order to wedge open the way to transformation in the future." This pandemic has been difficult, as have parts of the last few years for our congregation. Our obligation is to ensure that we learn from the inherent discomfort of change so we may move into our next phase together. I am proud to stand side by side with you in order to continue our never-ending journey to be those progressive leaders in our community, a light in the darkness. The next time you are asked, what are you going to think about and dream about? What will your response be? Whatever it may be, your responses, your stories are our stories. And as such, they have the power to help mold our collective narrative identity. We are South Church. I encourage us to consider answering that question from a place of redemption. I encourage us to remember both our individual and collective strengths made possible by our growth during this time. I encourage us to continue to be kind with ourselves and with one another during the transitions that will come. I encourage us to write our church's next chapter together. I encourage us. May it be so.